I death am 92 years old, and there are 7 things I stopped caring about. Not because I became wiser, but because caring almost destroyed me. If you see a young, you think time is generous. If you're still older, you think you understand it. Both are wrong. At 92, time isn't still allowed anymore. It doesn't rush. It doesn't still threaten. It just watches. I've outlived most of the people who knew my first name before it meant anything. I've buried friends who swore they'd never get old. I've watched entire eras fade quietly, without apology. And here's what no one tells you. Most of what you spend your life protecting doesn't survive you anyway. When you're still young, caring feels like strength. You care about being respected, being right, being admired, being safe, being ahead. You call it responsibility. You call it ambition. You call it love. But sometimes, it's just fear in a nicer suit. I cared deeply once, so deeply, it shaped every decision I made, every silence I kept, every truth I swallowed. I cared about what people thought, about appearing stable, about not rocking the boat, about holding on, even when my hands were bleeding. I told myself that caring meant I was a good man, a serious man, a man who mattered. But caring has a cost. No one invoices you for. It doesn't arrive all at once. It leaks into your life slowly, stealing sleep, then joy, then honesty. By the time you notice what it's taken, because you're already defending the loss. At 92, I no longer care about many things I once built my life around. Not because I'm bitter, not because I gave up, but because I finally saw the bill. There's a strange clarity that comes when you realize you're closer to the end than the beginning. The noise fades, the performances stop, the lies, especially the ones you told yourself, lose their power. You start asking different questions. Why did I tolerate that? Why did I stay silent there? Why did I spend decades trying to be acceptable instead of honest? I wish I could tell you this clarity comes gently. It doesn't state. It comes after loss, after regret, after realizing that the things you protected so fiercely never protected you back. The 7 things I stopped caring about didn't fall away all at once. They cracked, slowly, one illusion at a time. And the first illusion, the most dangerous one, is the belief that you are safe simply because nothing bad has happened yet. I believed that illusion for most of my life, and by the time it broke, it was already too late to pretend nothing had changed. For a long time, everything felt fine. Not perfect, not extraordinary, just stable enough to stop asking questions. I had a routine, a roof that didn't leak, people who knew my name, problems that felt manageable. And that's how safety really works. It doesn't announce itself. It hums quietly in the background, convincing you that tomorrow will look like today. We confuse familiarity with permanence. When nothing collapses for long enough, we start believing nothing ever will. I did. I believed that because I paid my dues, the world would remain reasonable. That because I followed the rules would protect me. That because disaster hadn't visited yet, it had forgotten my address. That belief is intoxicating. It allows you to delay difficult conversations, postpone hard choices, ignore the small discomforts that whisper, something isn't right. You don't call it denial. You call it patience, practicality, optimism. History is full of people who thought exactly the same way. Civilizations don't collapse in moments of panic. They collapse during long periods of comfort, when warning signs are explained away, and inconvenience feels more threatening than danger. I watched neighbors grow old beside me, each of us convinced we were standing on solid ground. We nodded at one another, shared polite smiles, talked about weather, prices, memories. No one wanted to be the person who said, something feels wrong, because saying it makes it real. Psychologists have a name for this. Normalcy bias. It's the reason people stay in burning buildings. The reason they don't evacuate until the water reaches the stairs. The reason they say, "It's never happened before," right before it happens. I lived inside that bias for decades. When small discomforts appeared, I minimized them. When unease crept in, I rationalized it. When instincts warned me, I told them to calm down. After all, nothing had gone terribly wrong yet. And that sips the most seductive lie of all. Safety doesn't vanish suddenly. It erodes, quietly, politely, while you're so busy maintaining appearances. The illusion of safety taught me to care deeply about things that didn't steady matter, and ignore the things that did. I cared about stability over truth, comfort over honesty, keeping things normal over confronting what was breaking underneath. Every generation believes collapse will be obvious, loud, impossible to miss. It never is. It arrives disguised as inconvenience, as temporary discomfort, as something you'll deal with later. The first warning sign in my life wasn't dramatic. It didn't scream. It didn't demand attention. It whispered. And because it didn't sound urgent, I taught myself not to listen. That whisper would return again and again, each time a little louder, and each time I found a reason to explain it away, until the day I realized the danger was no longer outside. It was the comfort I was protecting. And that picked when the illusion finally cracked, just enough to let something darker leak through. The first cracks never announced themselves as cracks. They arrive disguised as annoyances, minor frustrations. Things you promise yourself you'll fix later. A conversation you avoid because it feels uncomfortable. A relationship that grows quiet instead of honest. A feeling in your chest you dismiss as tiredness. I noticed them, but only in passing. Like hairline fractures in a wall you've lived beside for years. Nothing felt urgent enough to stop everything. So I didn't stack. That sips how denial survives. It doesn't argue with reality. It delays it. I remember the first time I thought, this isn't set how it's supposed to feel. The thought scared me. So I buried it beneath logic. Everyone feels this way sometimes. This will pass. I'm overthinking. We are very good at defending the lives we've already invested in. The more years you spend building something, the harder it becomes to admit it may be flawed. You don't want to face the possibility that your careful choices were built on fragile ground. So when the cracks appeared, I reframed them. Tension became just stress. Distance became normal aging. Unease became gratitude mixed with worry. Anything but what it actually was. A warning. People around me did the same. We spoke in softened language. We joked about serious things. We treated symptoms instead of causes. No one wanted to be dramatic. No one wanted to be difficult. No one wanted to admit that something fundamental was shifting. There's a quiet agreement people make with one another. Don't say it out loud, and maybe it won to be true. But truth doesn't need permission. The cracks widened slowly, not enough to panic, just enough to make ignoring them require effort. I started waking up tired, not in my body, but in my spirit. I felt present everywhere, and connected nowhere. I was surrounded, yet strangely alone. That loneliness is subtle at first. It doesn't stake, it hums. And once it starts, it rarely stops on its own. I still cared deeply then. Cared about keeping the peace, about being dependable, about not disappointing anyone. So I told myself, endurance was noble. That holding on was strength. That questioning too much meant weakness. But endurance without honesty doesn't make you strong. It makes you smaller. Every ignored crack required a little more of me to pretend everything was fine. And slowly, I began disappearing from my own life. That sips when the unease changed. It stopped whispering. It started knocking. Not loudly, not urgently, but consistently. And for the first time, I understood something was coming, whether I was ready to face it or not. Because cracks don't stay cracks forever. Eventually, they become breaks. And when they do, they don't ask if you're so prepared. At first I could still pretend nothing serious was happening. The cracks were visible now, but manageable. At least, that's what I told myself. I adjusted, instead of confronting, compromised instead of correcting. Explained away what no longer made sense. It felt responsible, mature, safe. This is the stage where denial becomes organized. You don't just ignore reality. You negotiate with it. You accept smaller losses to avoid larger truths. You convince yourself that adaptation is wisdom. I watched institutions do the same thing. Families, communities, entire systems built on the hope that gradual decay could be managed indefinitely. Warning signs were no longer subtle, but they were inconvenient. And inconvenience is easier to tolerate than upheaval. When problems become visible, people look for authority, for reassurance, for someone to say, "This is under control," and someone always does. I remember being told not to worry, that things had always been this way. That concern was an overreaction. I wanted to believe it, because belief was cheaper than change. Human beings are remarkably skilled at justifying bad decisions, especially when those decisions protect comfort, status, or identity. We tell ourselves stories. It's temporary. It's necessary. It could be worse. We stood doing our best. But beneath those stories was a growing tension I could no longer ignore. Conversations became strained. Silences grew heavier. Trust thinned, even when no one said why. I felt it in rooms before words were spoken. A weight, an unspoken understanding that something vital was slipping. This is when caring becomes dangerous. Because I cared about keeping things intact, even when they were already broken. I cared about avoiding conflict more than telling the truth. About being seen as reasonable rather than being real. About maintaining order instead of demanding integrity. And the more I cared, the more I participated in my own erasure. I stayed quiet when I should have spoken. Agreed when I should have objected. Smiled when something inside me was unraveling. There's a moment in every collapse, personal or collective, when denial stops being ignorance and becomes a choice. I crossed that moment without realizing it, because admitting the truth would have required me to let go of something I believed I needed. The idea that if I just held on a little longer, everything would stabilize again. It never does. By the time the seriousness could no longer be debated, the damage wasn't theoretical. It was emotional, psychological, irreversible in ways I didn't yet understand. That was when the realization landed, heavy and unmistakable. Some things don't collapse because they're attacked. They collapse because they're defended for too long. And I was still defending, even as the ground beneath me began to give way. There is always a moment, quiet, unremarkable, easy to miss, when everything could still be saved, not with heroics, not with grand gestures, but with one honest decision. I didn't recognize that moment when it arrived. It didn't feel like a crossroads. It felt like another compromise, another delay, another promise to myself that I would deal with it later. Later is a dangerous word. By then the signs were no longer subtle. The unease had names. The cracks had histories. The cost of caring had become visible in my body, my relationships, my silence. I knew what needed to be said. I knew what needed to change. And I knew what it would cost. That's the moment people rarely talk about. Not the disaster, but the choice just before it. The choice between discomfort now and devastation later. I chose comfort. Not because I was weak, but because I was tired. Tired of explaining. Tired of being the one who disrupts the room. Tired of risking the little stability I still had. So I stayed. I stayed quiet. I stayed agreeable. I stayed invested in something that no longer invested in me. I told myself it was loyalty, responsibility, love. It was fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of being wrong. Fear of discovering that letting go would hurt more than holding on. That decision didn't destroy everything immediately. That is what makes it so dangerous. Life continued. Routines held. Smiles returned. And I mistook survival for safety. But something fundamental shifted that day. After the point of no return, you said no longer choosing outcomes. You stood choosing which losses you still accept. Time stopped working in my favor. Every delay multiplied the cost of change. Every compromise narrowed the future. I felt it in small ways at first. A dull regret, a heaviness behind ordinary moments, a sense that I had betrayed something essential. By the time I admitted what I sped done, what I hadn't stood done, the consequences were already in motion. There was no dramatic collapse. No single event to blame. Just a slow closing of doors. That sips when I realized something terrifying. The most permanent damage isn't caused by mistakes. It's caused by the moments we knew better and chose not to act. I had crossed the point of no return, and I was about to learn what remains when the consequences finally arrive. Collapse doesn't look like the movies. There is no explosion, no screaming, no clear moment where everything ends. It looks like confusion, like exhaustion, like waking up one day and realizing the effort required to pretend has finally exceeded the strength you have left. For me, it began with quiet losses, conversations that never happened, relationships that faded without confrontation, dreams that didn't shatter. They simply stopped being mentioned. I remember long stretches of silence, not peaceful silence, the kind that presses against you, that asks questions you don't know how to answer. What happened? When did this change? Was it always like this? Fear arrived late. Not the sharp kind, the dull, sinking kind. The fear that you waited too long, that even if you wanted to act now, the shape of your life no longer allows it. I watched people drift away, not angrily, not dramatically, just elsewhere. And I understood something then. Collapse often looks like abandonment, including the way you abandon yourself. Days blurred. Time felt heavy. I wasn't panicking. I was numb. And numbness is what happens when emotion has nowhere safe to go. This is the consequence no one warns you about. Not loss, but emptiness. The realization that caring consumed so much energy. There was nothing left to feel when it finally ended. I stopped arguing, stopped explaining, stopped expecting. Not because I've found peace, but because resistance no longer made sense. The structure I had been holding together had already fallen inside me, and in that internal collapse, something else disappeared. The illusion that suffering would be meaningful, simply because it was endured. It wasn't. Endurance without truth doesn't make you noble. It makes you tired. I spent nights listening to the sound of my own breathing, wondering when I'd last felt alive, instead of just present. There is a particular grief that comes from realizing your pain did not save anything. It only postponed the inevitable. By the time the collapse was undeniable, there was nothing left to fight for. Only something left to understand. And that understanding would arrive slowly, through memory, through regret, through a clarity sharpened by loss. What remained after everything fell quiet was not destruction. It was reckoning, and I wasn't ready for what it would reveal. After the collapse, there is no immediate insight. There is just space. Too much of it. Silence stretches in unfamiliar ways when the noise is gone. No arguments to prepare for. No roles to perform. No future to manage the way you once did. At first, that space feels empty. Later, you realize it's exposed. There is nothing left to hide behind. I began remembering things I hadn't thought about in decades. Moments I dismissed as small at the time. Choices that felt insignificant. Words I swallowed because they seemed unnecessary. In the aftermath, they returned with weight. Regret doesn't arrive screaming. It arrives calmly, like someone sitting beside you, patient enough to wait until you're ready to listen. I saw patterns I refused to see before. How often I confused caring with control. How often I sacrificed honesty to preserve comfort. How often I stayed loyal to situations that required me to disappear. Not because anyone forced me, but because I was afraid of who I'd be without them. This is the realization that hurts the most. No one stole my life from me. I negotiated it away, slowly, reasonably, one careful compromise at a time. In the quiet, I also saw what survived. Not the things I protected so fiercely, but the moments when I was honest. The rare times I spoke despite the fear. The small acts of courage I once thought didn't matter. They mattered more than everything else. At 92, you don't romanticize the past. You don't rewrite it. You simply see it clearly, and clarity is merciless. I realized I had spent decades caring about being acceptable, instead of being aligned, about being needed, instead of being true, about avoiding loss, instead of avoiding regret. What remains after collapse is not despair. It's just instruction, a harsh kind, earned the hard way. The understanding that caring, when misplaced, can cost you your voice, your instincts, your life. I sat with that truth for a long time, long enough to know I couldn't start undo the past, but I could still name it, and naming it mattered, because the final thing collapse leaves you with is a responsibility to speak, not to justify, not to warn dramatically, but to say plainly and honestly, this is what happens when you care about the wrong things for too long. And in that responsibility, the final warning began to take shape. If you're still listening to this, you are earlier in your life than I am. That matters more than you think. Because the danger I'm speaking about doesn't announce itself as danger. It arrives dressed as responsibility, as patience, as maturity. You are taught to care about fitting in, about being reasonable, about keeping things together. You are praised for endurance, for sacrifice, for staying quiet when speaking would be inconvenient. And slowly, almost politely, you begin trading pieces of yourself for the promise of stability. Here is the truth I learned too late. Not everything you care about deserves your care. Some things feed on it. If caring requires you to shrink, to silence your instincts, to explain away the unease you feel in your own body, it is not loyalty. It is erosion. I stopped caring about being admired, about being agreeable, about being seen as good, at the cost of being honest. I stopped caring about maintaining illusions that asked me to betray myself. And I wish, more than I can properly say, that I had stopped sooner. Because time does not refund what you spend on fear. It only reveals the cost. You will tell yourself you have time, that it's not that serious yet, that things will become clearer later. Later is not guaranteed. Clarity does not arrive before consequence. It arrives after. So listen to the discomfort you keep explaining away. Pay attention to the quiet resistance inside you. Notice where your life feels heavy for no clear reason. That heaviness is information. At 92, I don't speak to scare you. I speak because silence already took enough from me. If you remember anything from this, let it be this. Caring is not virtue by default. It is a choice. Choose wisely. Because one day, much sooner than you expect, you will stop caring too. And what you let go of then will tell you everything about what truly mattered and what cost you your life before it was too late.